Hey guys, Mr. Irving again. So now we're going to do part 2 of our chapter 34 lecture on USA and the road into World War II. Where we left off last time is we were talking about Hitler and Stalin. They had signed that neutrality agreement, a non-aggression pact, meaning they wouldn't fight each other. That gave Hitler the green light to go ahead and take Poland. And when he invades Poland, Stalin soon invades later from the other half. Britain and France declare war on Hitler, and World War II is officially off to the races. So let's pick up right about there. Let's see where we were. About there? Okay. So back home, now that war has been launched, FDR is nervous. He's been increasingly nervous about the situation in Europe. But now he knows he needs to start doing something to move America away from legislating neutrality. We talked about all the other neutrality acts and how they've been keeping us by law from getting involved in the war. We didn't want to repeat a World War I where we got pulled into the war while trying to stay neutral. So FDR is trying to kind of break us from that. He wants the American people to start getting ready, kind of accepting this idea that for us to stay out of this war, then we have to support our allies. We have to let them fight for us, because if our allies fall, then we will get pulled into the war. So FDR is going to push through the Neutrality Act of 1939 through Congress. Now this is still going to institute the cash and carry policy of Neutrality Act of 37, but the big change on 39 is now we are allowed to sell war materials. We can trade munitions. Now the US was a big arms producing country, and we had tons of materials, and this is going to be a huge help to our allies because Britain, France, they desperately need the materials we can make, but we've been restricted from trading war materials with anyone under the previous neutrality acts. Now we can sell our weapons. We will make guns and tanks and bullets, and now we can sell those to belligerent nations. That's going to be hugely important to the survival of our allies in World War II. Another thing that gets started kind of early on in the war, once the war gets started, is the Manhattan Project. Now the Manhattan Project, you've all remembered probably a little bit about. That was the code name for the US program to develop nuclear weapons. Now Einstein was a super famous scientist in the US at that point. He's a German scientist who would tour around the US teaching in various universities for a couple months at a time. Well, he's also a German scientist, and while he was touring in the United States, he heard back from home that the Nazis had seized his property, they'd taken his sailboat, taken his house, so he realized that he was not going to go home, so he's going to stay in the United States for the duration of the war. While he's here, he's approached by some other scientists who basically say, hey, we need your name, basically. Sign this letter. That way we can get it to Roosevelt, try to make him aware of this new technology, this new science out there about splitting the atom, harnessing that energy, and turning it into a weapon. That's the whole basis of the atomic bombs. They were worried, these scientists were worried that Germany had already started working on this, which they had, so they didn't want Germany to develop a weapon form of this chain reaction first. So they go to Einstein. Einstein's going to sign the letter. He's going to send it off to FDR. Now a copy of that letter is on Haiku, so you can read that if you would like. So the whole letter, basically what it says is there's this new technology. It can produce possibly the most powerful weapon the world has ever seen. We should start putting some money and some research into this. FDR approves it. However, it won't get tons of funding until a few years later, really in 1942. It really gets going. But eventually it's going to be a huge project. It's going to grow into employ over 130,000 people. It's going to cost over $2 billion back then. In 2016 dollars, it's over $26 billion. So a lot of money goes into development of these weapons. And we'll talk later on about how they're used and debate whether they were truly needed or not. And the next big action in World War II is France. So after Germany invades Poland, and England and France declare war on Germany, we have a bit of a lull. Some historians call this the phony war. And for months, 6, 7, even 8 months, pretty much nothing is happening. Then all of a sudden the deadlock is broken when Hitler will quickly invade Denmark and then Norway, then the Netherlands and Belgium. So Hitler has now gone from nothing to invading a whole bunch of countries bordering France very quickly. Now France, since World War I, remember they're always paranoid about Germany, has built a very strong defensive line along their common border. And they defended it with something called the Maginot Line, which was a series of forts with giant guns and very strong defenses that would be difficult for Germany to penetrate. Germany, however, realized that the Maginot Line only goes so far. France did not put really strong defenses on their common border with Belgium. So Hitler decided, why go through the strong defenses when I can just go through Belgium? They will avoid the Maginot Line, and France will fall within a matter of weeks. The whole Battle of France lasts less than a month. Right about the same time, Churchill takes over as the Prime Minister in Great Britain, so he comes into power realizing we're pretty much it. Now France has fallen, Hitler has control, he has huge amounts of influence in Europe, and we are the next target. Very likely that the Battle of Britain will be the next big target for the Nazis. This is going to be important for a lot of reasons, but one, this is going to serve to be America's wake-up call. We always figured this war is never going to touch us. We have the ocean between us and Europe, the other ocean between us and Japan. While these empires are growing and getting stronger, they still can't get that close to us. Now, once France falls, we start to realize these forces are really strong and they are trying to dominate their entire regions. Eventually, those regions are going to keep growing. And now we only have one ally left fighting with Great Britain. So Congress now starts approving more money to start getting the military ready, just in case we do go to war. Now, America still was very isolationist. If FDR were to ask Congress for a declaration of war, they would say no. So unless we were invaded, the American people weren't going to want war. However, they start to put more and more money ready for that, just to build up the military, just in case. Now there's two acts. I'm going to kind of go into this. First up, we're going to have the Naval Expansion Act. Our military had fallen into disrepair, as you remember, during the Great Depression, because we were putting our money into New Deal programs and not into military spending. So we needed to build up our military fleet. The first Naval Expansion Act was in June of 1940, and it expands the size of the Navy by 11%. Now that's a pretty big boost. That is multiple new ships, destroyers, warships, and so on. However, a couple days after it was signed, France falls, and that once again gives that big jolt to Congress, so they're going to go back, re-vote, make the package bigger, and now the Navy is going to increase by over 100%. So double the size of the Navy. The goal being, we need to have a Navy big enough to fight in two different oceans at the same time. So either the Atlantic and the Pacific. Also, though, you need soldiers to be in those boats. Our military had fallen very small. I believe we were just at about 174,000 soldiers when the war breaks out. That puts us a little bit smaller than Romania. We're in the 20s in terms of biggest armies in the world. I mean, the military still had all old equipment built before World War I. The Army still owned thousands of cavalry horses. So we were way behind in terms of development compared to some of these new modern armies that were fighting in Europe. And we are going to have a draft. Our army is way too small compared to some of these other militaries. This will be the first peacetime draft in American history. Our other two drafts during the Civil War and World War I, both were issued once the war was already going on. FDR is going to support the idea for this only after his political opponent, who's going to be running in the next election, does as well, because drafts are very politically unpopular. But we needed more men for the Army, and not enough men were volunteering ahead of time. Initially, the qualifications for the draft are very lenient. I mean, everyone has to register for the draft. All men between the ages of 21 and 35 have to register. That'll later be expanded to all men between the ages of 18 and 65. Initially, the Congress is going to ask for about 1.2 million men for the Army, another 800,000 reserves, so about a 2 million man Army. So that's a huge increase compared to our Army of just over 100,000 to start with. Now, to be eligible, you had to be 5 feet tall, weigh at least 105 pounds, have half your teeth. Initially, they had to be able to read and write to serve in the Army. However, after hundreds of thousands of men are rejected, we're going to drop that requirement, and no longer do you have to be able to read and write to serve. Now, over the course of the war, millions of men, about 16 million men and women, are going to serve in our armed forces. Now, that's not all at once. The Army's going to grow past that initial 2 million, but not by a huge amount. So that's over the course of time. Because when the draft first starts, you only serve for 1 year. FDR later extends that. If you were drafted, you serve for 2 years. But there'll be men and women coming in and out of the military. Now, of that 16 million men who serve, about 5 million of those were volunteers, but the rest were drafted. So some historians have gone back to argue World War II, not the most popular war, because you can see, because most men had to be drafted into it, didn't want to just go and volunteer to fight in the war itself. Over in Europe, so now that France has fallen, the Battle of Britain has begun. Hitler had to take out England. England had declared war on Germany. It's the last force left, kind of that keeps him from having total dominance of Europe. He had a plan, the Nazis, to invade England. The plan was called Operation Sea Lion. Now, there's not a huge water distance between France and England. You can see France from England. So this wouldn't be a huge task to put a bunch of Nazis on boats, sail them across the water, or send them across the water, and invade. However, before Hitler could do that, he had to destroy England's defenses, because if England had strong defenses, they could take out the boats, the Nazis wouldn't make it over there. So what the Battle of Britain becomes is a big aerial battle over England, where German bombers come and bomb cities. English fighters go out and try to shoot down the bombers before they get there. It is a horrific battle. It's going to go on for months. Luckily for the Allies, Hitler was unsuccessful. Even though they dropped tons of bombs on England and shoot down countless British fighters, they were never able to completely destroy England's defenses. Germany eventually decides we have not weakened England enough to launch that invasion, so Hitler will never launch Operation Sea Lion. He'll never invade England. Now, there's a lot of pictures you've seen probably before of the English sleeping in the subways underneath the city. That's where they would go when they would hear the air raids of the German bombers are coming. You have to get underground for safety. And there's a link there where you can look at tons of pictures of the Battle of Britain period. And we'll spend a lot more time talking about this next year in European history. Now, while Americans are still sympathetic towards the English in this situation, even the bombing of Britain is not enough to make America want to enter the war. They're still largely isolationist, and it's going to take something more dramatic to get America to join in. Now, so Churchill, now in charge there in England, they're going through the Battle of Britain. They realize we need more materials or we're going to lose this war. So he goes to FDR. He says, FDR, you got to do something to help us. We know you can't declare war, but something. FDR is going to use an executive order and push through the destroyer base deal. So this gets signed in September of 1940, and basically what it says is we are going to send 50 of America's old destroyers, so big battleships, over to Britain. Britain will then, in exchange, give us 99-year leases for 8 bases in the Western Hemisphere. So 8 English bases in America that we could use. Now the benefits for England, pretty obvious. They get 50 destroyers. They can use those to help secure their waters. then the newer destroyers they can use to escort supplies going back and forth from America or hunt for Nazi submarines, but make them much stronger naval-wise. Also, because they're giving up those 8 bases, all the personnel that were in those bases, they can take those out and bring them back to Europe to aid in the fight. Also, the money they were spending to run those 8 bases, now they can save up that money and use it to buy more supplies. Remember, we still have cash and carry, so they have to use money to keep getting American supplies. From the American perspective, what would we gain from this? Well, by gaining these 8 bases in the Atlantic Ocean, let's say worst case scenario, England falls. Well, now at least we have kind of a early detection system, more of a warning system. So if the Nazis start coming across the Atlantic Ocean, we would have more forts, more bases. We'd be in better position to defend ourselves, to see them coming, so all of a sudden they don't emerge in New York Harbor or Savannah or somewhere else and we didn't see them coming. Now, this was very politically unpopular when it was pushed through. FDR didn't consult Congress at all. Some people are saying he should be impeached for overstepping his bounds, but eventually that does die down. Here's a quick map of what those 8 bases were and where they were. You can see there are some up in Canada and Newfoundland, a base in Bermuda, the Bahamas, Antigua, St. Lucia, Trinidad, Guyana, Jamaica. So greatly extends our reach into the Atlantic Ocean to prepare our interests and our coastline in that way. Now let's talk about Japan for a little bit. What is going on with Japan? Now, Japan is an emerging empire in the Pacific. Kind of like Hitler or Italy, after the Treaty of Versailles in World War I, they realized we didn't get what we want out of this treaty. The only way to be respected is to be stronger, have a bigger military, and Japan decided we need to dominate this region in the Pacific. We are the most industrial, we have the strongest military. So in the 30s, they go on to try to expand their empire and see that happen. In 1931, they invade Manchuria. In 1933, they invade northern China. In 1937, they're going to invade more mainland China from that. So they are really pushing their empire and trying to spread out their sphere of influence as much as they can. For a lot of that, we're going to basically turn a blind eye towards it. We don't want to fight Japan. Again, we were isolationist in the 30s. So until they really cross the line, we're going to let them kind of get away with expanding their sphere of influence. Now, Japan, one reason why they're expanding so quickly is they were a different kind of empire than the United States was, say, earlier in its history. The United States is very lucky to have lots of raw materials. We have pretty much any raw material you could want. Japan is an island empire and lacks a lot of the key raw materials they need to keep expanding, to keep fueling their war machine. They need fuel, they need scrap metal, they need rubber, they need a lot of these things. And since they can't produce them naturally within their own borders, the only way to gain them is to invade countries that have these natural materials or buy them, so get them through trade on the international market. Now, for a long time, they got them from us. When FDR was president, even when Japan invades China, we never declare that a war. So therefore, we can keep selling goods to Japan. We were sending them a lot of fuel, a lot of scrap metal, and that was helping our economy recover a bit. However, this starts to turn the other way in 1937 when they invade China. If you remember, the U.S. was always nervous about China. China is this huge potential market. There's a lot of natural resources there, a lot of potential customers for goods. We always said China should be an open market. We never wanted a European power to dominate it or a Japanese power. If you remember the open door note we had talked before, we said China should have to be kept open. No sphere of influence could dominate it and turn it into a closed market. We wanted it to be an open market. However, when Japan invades China, if Japan were to conquer China, they would turn that into a closed market. So they would say all those Chinese customers must buy Japanese goods. That would therefore hurt the U.S. economy. Once our economic recovery comes into it, the U.S. becomes much more interested in the situation. Japan's also going to push the envelope a little further when they signed the Tripartite Pact in, I believe it was 1940. So the other two members of that pact will be Hitler and Italy. So now we have three growing empires who are trying to spread their sphere of influence and makes the U.S. more and more nervous. So we'll talk more about Japan in a little bit. Back home, it's almost election time. Now Roosevelt was totally planning on retiring after his second term. He was going to follow the two-term tradition set out by George Washington that every president had honored up to this point. Now it's not a law, but it's just a precedent, and that's just what people do. Roosevelt was no different. He had even bought or had the cottage built that he was going to retire to write his memoirs. He was totally done with being president. Late in his second term is when he starts to get very nervous about the situation. The world economic and safety situation with Hitler growing its empire, Japan growing its empire, has made him very nervous about what if we have this transition between me and somebody else. And that somebody else isn't prepared to kind of nudge America towards the war. FDR's great fear is that if we're going to wait too long, if we don't support our allies enough, and we let our allies fall, then all of a sudden Hitler will dominate Europe, him and Mussolini, Japan will dominate the Pacific, and one day we'll wake up and we will have to be fighting all of these growing empires on our own without any allies to help us. America will be forced into war and we will be alone. So FDR doesn't want that to happen, so he decides to run, again, for an unprecedented third term. That's going to be very unpopular. A lot of Democrats will go against him because he's going for a third term. The Republicans pick a guy named Wendell Willkie, wins their nomination, who FDR was very nervous about. He thought he was a very formidable opponent. Now, FDR will win this election, but it is much closer than his previous two elections. And the big reason is he's able to communicate to the American people, this is too dangerous a situation to change. You don't want to basically change your ship midstream. So they're going to stick with FDR. And now that he's elected, and again, he runs on a campaign of, we don't want to go to this war. We're going to prepare. We're going to help our allies, but we're not going to go to war. Similar to how Woodrow Wilson runs for re-election before World War I, ran as a, we're going to be isolationists, we're not getting involved in the war, and then take steps to push us towards the war afterwards. FDR will be similar. Once he comes in, he wins this election, doesn't have to worry about the public anymore. He's going to take more steps to not push America into the war, but prepare our allies to fight this war without us more. So America's got to take a bigger step in supporting our allies in this war than we have so far. So FDR's policy about this is, you can kind of call armed neutrality. We don't want to go to the war. American people are too isolationist to change from that. But he's got to convince them that for us to stay neutral, for us to stay isolationist, we have to take a bigger role in supporting our allies. He's going to give his Four Freedoms speech, which is also the 1941 State of the Union, in which he basically outlines there are 4 freedoms that everyone across the world should experience. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, which are both encapsulated in our First Amendment and the Constitution, but also freedom from want and freedom from fear. And the spread of these empires is keeping people from experiencing all 4 of those freedoms. Later on in the speech, he's going to start talking about how we need to take a greater role in supporting our allies against the forces who are taking these freedoms away from people. Basically, what was happening is Britain is out of money. Our lone ally left. They've been depending on our supplies from America, and now they no longer have the cash to purchase those supplies. And under the last neutrality law of '39, unless they have cash, and under cash and carry, they can't get any more materials. FDR doesn't want that to happen, so he is going to get the Lend-Lease law passed. Lend-Lease, it's kind of an interesting idea, and it's a bit of good politics. It basically says that America can lend or lease war materials to anyone we decide is important to the independence of America or important to the defense of the United States. So instead of they have to pay cash and carry on their boats, we will give our war supplies. We will lend them tanks, airplanes, bullets, guns, whatever they need, and then they will give it back to us after the war is over. Now, FDR sold this as a way to keep us out of the war. We are sending guns instead of our sons. And he even uses an analogy to try to get this through to people. He said, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you wouldn't charge him to use your garden hose. You would just let them use their hose, they'd put out the fire, and then you'd bring it back. And it started to make sense to enough people. But Lend-Lease gets approved by Congress and is going to be hugely important, because now with Lend-Lease, we start funneling more and more war materials to Great Britain. By the time the war is over, we've sent over $54 billion worth of aid to our allies, Great Britain being the principal reciprocant of that aid. They get, I think, over about $36 billion of aid just on their own. And this is going to have a huge effect on the American economy. We were coming out of the Great Depression. We were doing better kind of each year during the late 30s. But now with this pulls us right out. I believe this hired about 6 million Americans just within 12 months. Every day, thousands more Americans got hired to work in these defense companies that were hiring everyone because they want their factories humming at full capacity and operating 24 hours a day, making these munitions. So this pulls our economy out of the Great Depression to a good place. Another instance of FDR's armed neutrality is his shoot-on-sight order, which was passed in September of '41. Now basically the U.S. was escorting the British ships when they were taking our goods from America back into British waters. FDR would call these neutrality patrols, but we would send our warships escorting those goods on the British ships. Hitler obviously upset by this. We were clearly favoring one side than him. We're supporting Great Britain. Great Britain's at war with him. So he's going to expand his war zone for where the German ships could sink anything that comes into that war zone and claim that is legal. If Hitler's then going to fire on a USS ship called the Greer. The Greer was a US warship, and FDR, once the ship is fired upon, says, we are fired upon unfairly, so he's going to issue shoot-on-sight order, which basically says all American vessels fire. As soon as you see any German ship or an Italian submarine, shoot them. He also will arm American merchant ships. Now, he says he did this as an act of self-defense. Hitler would say the Germans fired on the Greer because the USS Greer was following around German submarines and relaying their positions to British ships so the British ships could come and destroy the German submarines. So FDR was not totally honest on what the Greer was doing. It was not completely unprovoked. But it's not the last time the president hasn't given the full truth when talking about a naval attack, when he's trying to kind of push the country more towards war. So we'll talk more about LBJ and Vietnam later on this year. Now here's a map of Lend-Lease as it goes in where this aid is going. Now the thickness of these purple arrows indicate how much money is going where. The thicker the arrow, the more money. You see, the thickest arrow is going towards Great Britain. But a lot of arrows are going towards the Soviet Union. You might be thinking, why would we be sending aid to the Soviet Union? Stalin has a non-aggression pact with Hitler. What's happening there? Well, we're going to spend a lot of time on Operation Barbarossa and the war between Hitler and Stalin next year. But in short, Hitler is going to decide to break the non-aggression pact and launch Operation Barbarossa, which was the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and trying to take them out of the war. Hitler's way of thinking about this is we're going to have to fight Stalin one day. Now, my army is very strong, I have the element of surprise, Stalin's only getting stronger day by day as his country's army gets bigger and more industrialized, so might as well attack now when he doesn't see it coming, and I have the tactical advantage. So in June of 41, Hitler will invade the Soviet Union. He will get very close to conquering the Soviet Union. They're only stopped miles away from Moscow, from the Soviet's capital. But the big importance for us for this is this forces the Soviet Union to switch sides. Now the Soviet Union joins the Allies with Great Britain. That means they are eligible for Lend-Lease. We think the Soviet Union is important for America's defenses. They're fighting Germany, so therefore we give them aid as well. So we will ship our weapons of war, our tools of war, to the Soviets as well. We'll give them over $11 billion worth of aid over the course of the war. Now, as we said, America was never going to enter this war until they were attacked. That's where Pearl Harbor is going to come into it. Now, as we said, Japan was expanding their empire and their influence in the Pacific. They were dependent upon our help to do that. They needed American metal, American fuel to kind of keep their expansion going. Well, eventually, late in 1940, we kind of draw a line. Japan invades Indochina, French Indochina, and we place an embargo on Japan, meaning we will no longer trade those materials with them. We won't give them any more fuel, we won't give them any more metal. And at that point, Japan kind of stops expanding. They have this point of, oh, maybe we've gone too far. We're dependent on America, we can't get these goods elsewhere right now. Let's stop and we'll talk about this and try to figure it out diplomatically. Then, in 1941, Japan, they've already signed the Tripartite Pact at this point. They're going to continue their expansion. They kind of go further into Indochina. So at this point, FDR is once again going to kind of provoke them a little bit further. 41, FDR is going to close the Panama Canal. He's going to freeze all of Japan's assets in the United States and basically mean they can't get access to their money here in the US anymore. Closing the Panama Canal, very important for Japan because that's how they get a lot of their goods from the Americas into the Pacific Ocean, and now they can't get those. So Japan now is at another bit of a freeze point. They don't seem to be able to get to a compromise with America through diplomacy. America doesn't want Japan to expand anymore. Japan says we have to keep expanding. So Japan starts thinking, what are we going to do to stop this? And they decide attacking makes the most sense. America's army is weak at this point. Our draft hasn't even really started. We've just started building up our Navy. FDR had moved pretty much the entire Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii, which is very close, not super close to Japan, but almost as a means of provoking them. So if Japan were to attack now, if they could wipe out all of America's fleet, take America out of the war, then they're good to go. They don't have to worry about America freezing their assets or placing embargoes on them anymore. If they can make one big solid show of strength, that America would back down. So it makes sense from the Japanese perspective to attack. Now America, it's not like we were totally shocked by this. We froze Japan's assets, we had placed an embargo on them, we had beefed up our presence in the Pacific where Japan was trying to expand, and at this point we'd even cracked Japan's code on how they were communicating. So we thought an attack was likely, but we did not think it would happen in Hawaii. We thought it was much more likely they would attack somewhere closer to them, maybe the Philippines or Hong Kong or Wake Island or Guam or a whole number of targets that would have been easier, closer to Japan's resources than going to thousands of miles to Hawaii. But that is where they will attack. On December 7th, 1941, early in the morning, Japan will launch a huge military attack on Pearl Harbor base in Hawaii. It is the worst attack on American soil up to that point. In fact, it's so bad that the War Department keeps secret how destructive it was for years and won't tell the public. But there's thousands of American casualties, over 2,400 men are killed, about 160 U.S. aircraft are destroyed, virtually the entire Pacific Fleet of our Navy is destroyed there in Pearl Harbor. It's just tons of destroyers and naval ships, all virtually wiped out. And at this point, Japan's made this big attack, and now FDR has the attack he needs. He goes before Congress the next day. He says this day will live in infamy, and he asks Congress to declare that a state of war now exists with Japan. And once we declare war on Japan, because they have an alliance with Germany and Italy, they now sign on and declare war on us. So the significance of the Pearl Harbor attack, you can say, is this what finally changes America from being isolationist to forcing them to enter the war? Now, you read that chapter by Hastings about this. So if any other questions, please see me after class, or just be sure you've done that reading. Let's talk a little bit more about the Pearl Harbor attack, and then we'll call it a day. The attack was so devastating because of the way the attack happened. Now, we were expecting Japan to attack somewhere, but we didn't expect the attack there. And even if they did make an attack that far out there, either at Pearl Harbor or even the west coast of the United States, we expected more of a sabotage style attack than a full-on hundreds of ships and bombers attack. So we moved our naval ships inside of the harbor. So there's a little map there in the top right-hand corner of Pearl Harbor. We moved all of our ships basically in a row on the interior to make it more or less likely that sabotage attack would work. Unfortunately, this makes it the worst possible arrangement to keep your ships for a big bomber attack, because now all of our destroyers and all of our naval ships are lined up in a row. So if you're Japanese pilots flying a bomber, it's the easiest possible run you could make. Now, Hawaii was not, and so why is this attack so devastating? It's like dropping a bowling ball into a basket full of eggs. It was very easy to just destroy everything. The eggs weren't scattered around. They were all in one place. Hawaii was not the only target. Your textbook seems to only really mention Hawaii, but this was a huge naval attack. It also attacked Guam and Midway and Thailand and the Philippines, and several targets all at once. It was not isolated just to Hawaii. It was one of the biggest naval attacks in history. So a truly ingenious and devastating attack from the Japanese. One thing that's also crazy about Pearl Harbor is it could have been so much worse. While it was the worst attack ever in terms of destruction and death, the most valuable source that we had, so our most valuable naval ship, happened to be gone. We had 3 aircraft carriers that were put out in the Pacific. Aircraft carriers are going to be the most important vessel, naval vessel in World War II. Luckily, that morning, all 3 of those aircraft carriers were not in the harbor at Pearl Harbor, so they escaped without being destroyed. Also, because all of these American ships were sunk in the harbor, that means we were able to recover them. The harbor is not as deep as out further in the ocean would have been. So if they are sunk in the ocean, they go down miles. We can never get those ships again. In Pearl Harbor, the ships go down, but most of them could be salvaged. We could rise them up. The Japanese also didn't destroy the repair yard there in Pearl Harbor. So those ships were patched up, and most of them saw action again before the war was over. So we were able to save a lot of our ships. I guess that's enough for now. We will get into the war itself when we come back. Bye.